The courthouse stood like it always had. Gray stone, tall columns, and heavy wooden doors that creaked every time someone pushed through. Outside, rain fell in soft sheets, turning the sidewalks slick and sending people hurrying under umbrellas or ducking into doorways. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and floor polish. It was just another Tuesday morning in County Courtroom 3, the kind of day most people would forget by dinner. Up on the bench sat the judge, a man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and a reputation for running a tight, no-nonsense courtroom. He'd been on the bench for over a decade, and folks said he never let emotion cloud his rulings. Today's docket was routine, mostly family matters, custody disputes, visitation schedules, a few adoption finalizations. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the local paper. In the second row from the back, a little girl sat quietly beside a woman who held her hand gently but firmly. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. She wore a clean but slightly too big dress, her dark hair pulled back in 2 neat braids. Her eyes, wide and watchful, took in everything. The bailiff standing near the door, the lawyers whispering over folders, the clock ticking slowly above the judge's head. She didn't fidget, didn't whisper, just watched. The case before the court involved a custody review. A child welfare officer stood at the podium speaking in calm, measured tones about home visits, school reports, and psychological evaluations. The biological father sat on one side of the aisle, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. On the other side, a foster parent, older, kind-faced, nodded along with the officer's words. It was the kind of hearing that dragged, full of legal phrases and careful wording, the kind most people tuned out after 5 minutes. But the little girl wasn't tuning out. She'd been told to stay quiet, to listen, and to let the grown-ups handle things. And she had. For nearly an hour, she'd done exactly that. But something about the way the judge leaned forward then something in the tilt of his head as he asked a question about prior incidents and documented concerns made her stiffen. Her fingers tightened around the woman's hand. Then, without warning, she stood up. A soft gasp rippled through the room. The child welfare officer paused mid-sentence. The bailiff took a half-step forward, hand resting lightly on his belt. Even the father looked up startled, but the girl didn't run, didn't cry. She simply walked, calmly, deliberately, down the center aisle, her small shoes clicking softly against the worn tile floor. She stopped right in front of the judge's bench and looked up. The judge, who had been scanning a file, glanced up and froze. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the building's old heating system and the soft patter of rain against the high windows. Then the girl opened her mouth and said 4 words. "You knew my mom." The effect was instant. The judge's face, usually unreadable, carved from years of courtroom composure, went pale. Not just pale, ashen. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. His breath caught just slightly, but enough that the bailiff noticed and shifted his weight, ready to act if needed. But the judge raised a hand, just slightly, stopping him. He stared at the girl. Really stared. Not with annoyance, not with impatience, but with something deeper. Recognition? Guilt? Shock? It was hard to tell, but whatever it was, it ran deep. The courtroom remained dead silent. Even the lawyers, used to dramatic outbursts and emotional pleas, seemed stunned into stillness. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't part of any legal strategy. This was raw, real, and it came from a child who shouldn't even have been allowed to speak in court. The foster mother finally moved, rising quickly and hurrying down the aisle. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," she whispered, reaching for the girl's shoulder. She didn't mean to, but the girl didn't pull away. She kept her eyes locked on the judge, and the judge, after a long, shaky breath, did something no one expected. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, and spoke softly, so only those closest could hear. "How do you know that?" he asked. The girl didn't answer right away. She just kept looking at him, her expression steady, as if she'd been waiting a long time to say those words, and now that she had, she was watching to see what they'd do. The foster mother gently touched her arm again. "Sweetheart, we need to go back and sit down." But the judge held up a finger. "Wait," he turned slightly to the court reporter. "Go off the record for a moment." A murmur went through the room. going off the record during a live hearing? That was unusual, but no one objected. Everyone was too curious, too unsettled to speak up. The judge looked back at the girl. "What's your name?" She told him. He nodded slowly as if the name meant something to him. Then he glanced toward the clerk. "Pull case file 2014 CV0872, sealed domestic matter. Elena Rodriguez." The clerk blinked. "That file's been archived, Your Honor, and sealed by order of—" "I know whose order," the judge said quietly. "Just pull it." The room felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. The biological father had gone still, eyes darting between the judge and the girl. The child welfare officer closed her folder slowly, sensing this hearing had just veered far off course. The little girl didn't seem afraid. If anything, she looked relieved. Like a weight had lifted just by saying those 4 words. Minutes ticked by. The rain outside softened to a drizzle. Sunlight tried to push through the clouds, casting thin golden streaks across the courtroom floor. When the clerk finally returned with a dusty manila folder, thick with old tabs and red confidential stamps, the judge took it without a word. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the first page. Then he stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked up at the girl again. "You look just like her," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, and in that moment, the courtroom wasn't about custody schedules or legal procedures anymore. It was about a moment frozen in time, a moment someone had tried to bury, but that had just walked in through the front door, wearing a too-big dress and braids, and speaking 4 words that changed everything. The judge closed the file gently, as if it might break. "Court is adjourned for 30 minutes, he announced, his voice firmer now but with a new kind of weight behind it. "We'll reconvene at 11:15. As people began to murmur and gather their things, the judge didn't leave the bench. He just sat there, staring at the folder in his hands, while the little girl stood quietly in front of him. 2 lives, years apart, suddenly connected by a truth no one saw coming. The courtroom emptied slowly like water draining from a tub. Lawyers gathered their files, whispering in low tones. The bailiff lingered near the door, watching but not interfering. The foster mother stood a few feet away from the little girl, arms crossed, torn between pulling her back and giving her space. She knew better than anyone how long this child had carried silence like a secret. Up on the bench, the judge hadn't moved. He sat with the old file open in front of him, fingers resting on a faded photograph paper clipped to the top page. In it, a young woman stood on courthouse steps, same eyes, same quiet strength in her stance. The girl's mother, Elena. He hadn't seen that photo in over 10 years. Had hoped he never would again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight now spilled through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air and glinting off the brass nameplate on his bench. But inside, the air felt thick, like the room itself was holding its breath. The girl hadn't moved either. She just stood there, small but steady, as if she'd known this moment would come and that when it did, she'd be ready. Finally, the judge looked up. "Come closer," he said, voice softer than before. She took 2 steps forward, stopping just at the edge of the bench where the wood met the floor. "You said I knew your mom," he began, choosing his words carefully. "What made you say that?" The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges, creased from being opened and closed too many times. She held it out. The judge hesitated, then leaned down and took it. He unfolded it slowly. It was a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local woman drops charges in domestic dispute." Below it was a grainy photo, Elena standing beside a man in a suit. Not a police officer, not a lawyer from the district attorney's office, him. Younger, thinner, hair darker, but unmistakably him. On the back, in delicate handwriting that matched the photo in the file, were 4 words. "The only one who believed me." His throat tightened. He remembered that day clearly. It had been late spring. He wasn't a judge then, just a public defender trying to do right by people the system often forgot. Elena had come to him scared, bruised, but determined. She'd filed a report, pressed charges, even testified at the preliminary hearing. Then 2 days before trial, she vanished from the courthouse. When he found her outside, she was pale, shaking, and refused to say why she was dropping everything. He'd begged her to reconsider, told her he'd protect her, but she just shook her head and whispered, "You can't." He never saw her again. Now here was her daughter, standing in the same courtroom, holding proof that Elena had remembered him, that she'd trusted him even if only for a moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice rough. "My grandma kept it," the girl said simply. "She said Mom used to talk about you, said you were the only one who listened." The judge closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, there was something new in his expression. Not just shock, but sorrow. And maybe shame. "I should have done more," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. The girl tilted her head. "Did you try to find her?" He didn't answer right away, because the truth was complicated. Yes, he'd filed missing persons reports. Yes, he'd called shelters, hospitals, even old neighbors. But after weeks turned to months and months to years, the trail went cold. Life moved on. He got promoted, took the bench, buried the memory under layers of rulings and routines, but not completely. "I tried," he finally said, "but not hard enough." She nodded as if she understood more than most adults ever would. Just then, the foster mother stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm so sorry for the interruption. She's been carrying this a long time, ever since her grandmother passed last winter. She's been asking questions." Looking through old boxes, she saw the photo, recognized this courthouse, and insisted we come today. The judge looked at her. "You knew about this?" "No, not until last night. She showed me the clipping and said, 'He'll know what to do.'" I didn't think she meant this. A silence settled between them. Not awkward, but heavy with meaning. Then the judge did something unexpected. He stood up, walked around the bench, and knelt down so he was at the girl's eye level. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her space. Just met her gaze. "Your mom was brave," he said. "Braver than most people realize. And you are too." She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. Just a little. He stood again and turned to the clerk who had been hovering near the door. "Call Detective Ruiz in the cold case unit. Tell him I need to speak with him today. And pull all related files on Elena Rodriguez, police reports, hospital records, anything tied to case 2014 CV 0872. The clerk nodded and hurried out. Then the judge turned back to the girl and her foster mother. "This hearing isn't over. But what happens next? It might not be about custody anymore." The foster mother's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, glancing at the file in his hand, "some things don't stay buried just because we stop looking." He walked back to the bench but didn't sit. Instead, he placed the old photo back in the folder and closed it gently. "When court reconvenes, I'll be recusing myself from this case. It's no longer appropriate for me to preside, but—" the foster mother started. He held up a hand. "Don't worry. I won't walk away. Not this time." The girl looked up at him, searching his face. "Will you help me find out what happened to her?" He didn't promise miracles. Didn't say everything will be okay, because he'd learned long ago that life doesn't work that way. But he did say this: "I'll do everything I can." And for the first time since she'd walked into that courtroom, the girl's eyes glistened not with fear, but with something close to hope. Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, casting long shadows across the empty seats. The clock above the bench ticked steadily toward 11:15. But time, for once, didn't feel like it was moving forward. It felt like it had looped back, bringing two lost pieces together, not to fix the past, but to finally face it. And in that quiet moment, before the lawyers returned and the gavel fell again, something shifted. Not just in the case, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of two people who thought they'd been alone in remembering someone the world had forgotten. The judge took a deep breath, straightened his robe, and prepared to do what he should have done years ago: follow the truth no matter where it led. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog that refused to lift. The judge, no longer presiding over the girl's case but quietly working behind the scenes, spent hours in his chambers, poring over files that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Dust clung to the edges of folders. Paper clips had rusted. Some pages were so brittle they threatened to crumble at a touch, but he handled each one like it held a piece of a life that mattered. He remembered Elena clearly now, not just her case, but her voice. Soft but firm, the way she'd sit with her hands folded tightly in her lap, like she was holding herself together by sheer will. She'd come to him after her third visit to the emergency room, bruises fading but fear still fresh in her eyes. She didn't want money, didn't want revenge, just safety. A chance to breathe. He'd believed her, truly believed her. And that was rare back then, when domestic cases were often dismissed as family drama or private matters. He'd filed motions, pushed for protective orders, even arranged for her to stay in a safe house. But 2 days before the trial, she showed up at the courthouse alone, pale and trembling, and withdrew every charge. When he asked why, she just whispered, "It's safer this way," and walked out without looking back. He never found out what changed her mind. Until now. The girl, quiet, observant, carrying her mother's eyes like a torch, had unknowingly handed him the first real clue in years. That old newspaper photo, the note on the back, it wasn't just a memory. It was a message, a plea from the past. Detective Ruiz came by the third day. A veteran of the cold case unit, he moved slowly but saw everything. He listened without interrupting as the judge laid out what he knew and what he suspected. When he showed him the photo and the file, Ruiz's expression darkened. "We looked into her disappearance," he said quietly. "But without a body, without a witness, it was just another missing persons case that went cold. People move on. Start over. Happens more than you think." But she didn't move on. The judge replied. She left a daughter behind. And someone made sure no one followed the trail. Ruiz nodded slowly. "Maybe it's time we looked again." What they found next sent a chill through both of them. Buried in archived police reports was a statement from a neighbor. Someone who'd seen a car idling outside Elena's apartment the night she vanished. Not just any car. A dark sedan with a broken taillight. The same kind driven by her former partner. A man with a record of intimidation, threats, and one sealed juvenile offense that never made it into public files. Back then, the lead had gone nowhere. No proof, no cooperation from witnesses. But now, with fresh eyes and new context, it looked different. More troubling was a notation in the original court file, handwritten in the margin by a clerk long retired. Judge inquired about witness protection. Denied due to lack of active threat. The judge stared at those words for a long time. He remembered that request. He'd pushed for it, been told it wasn't justified. At the time, he'd accepted the answer. Now it felt like a failure he'd been carrying without even knowing it. Meanwhile, the girl stayed with her foster mother, waiting. She didn't ask constant questions, didn't demand answers, but every evening she'd sit at the kitchen table and draw pictures of a woman with long hair holding her hand, of a courthouse with sunlight streaming through the windows, of a man in a robe kneeling down to talk to her. Simple lines. Quiet hope. Her foster mother watched her carefully. "You're not scared?" she asked one night as they washed dishes side by side. The girl shook her head. "I think Mom wanted me to find him." "Why?" "Because he's the only one who didn't look away." Those words hit harder than any legal argument ever could. Back at the courthouse, the judge made a call he'd avoided for years, to the state attorney's office, to a colleague he hadn't spoken to since his promotion. He didn't ask for favors, just facts. And what he learned confirmed his worst fears. Key witness statements from Elena's original case had never been entered into the official record. Not lost, not misplaced, never filed. Someone had made sure the full story never saw the light of day. He sat back in his chair, the weight of it pressing down on him. It wasn't just about one missing woman anymore. It was about a system that failed her and might still be protecting the people who made her disappear. But this time, he wouldn't let it go. He reached for the phone again. This time he called a retired court clerk, a woman known for her sharp memory and sharper tongue. She answered on the second ring. "Yeah?" she said, voice crackling through the line. "It's Judge Myers," he said. "I need to ask you about a case from 2014. Elena Rodriguez." A long pause. Then softly, "I wondered if someone would ever ask about her." He leaned forward. "What do you remember?" "I remember she was scared," the clerk said. But not of him. She was scared of what would happen if she talked. Said they had eyes everywhere, even in the courthouse. The judge's blood ran cold. "Who's they?" "I never got a name. But she mentioned someone high up. Someone who made sure her file stayed quiet." He thanked her and hung up, heart pounding. It was vague, circumstantial, but it was enough to keep digging. That night he didn't go home. He stayed in his office, rereading every page, connecting dots that had been invisible before. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a judge handing down rulings from a distance. He felt like a man trying to make things right for someone who couldn't speak for herself anymore. And somewhere across town, a little girl slept peacefully, clutching a drawing of her mother and the man who finally listened. The breakthrough came not from a grand courtroom revelation or a dramatic confession, but from a dusty storage room in the basement of the old police precinct. Detective Ruiz, armed with a fresh warrant and a stubborn streak, had spent 2 days sifting through boxes labeled inactive domestic pre-2015. Most were filled with routine reports, carbon copies, and faded intake forms. But in the bottom of the third box, wrapped in a plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age, he found it. A sealed envelope marked, Elena R. Witness Statement, Do Not File. It hadn't been logged, hadn't been entered into evidence, hadn't even been opened. Ruiz brought it straight to the judge's chambers, handing it over without a word. The judge sat at his desk, sunlight streaming through the blinds, and carefully peeled back the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Elena's handwriting, shaky but clear. She'd written it the night before she dropped the charges. If anything happens to me, it's because he has help. People who wear suits, not just boots. They watch the courthouse. They know who talks. I tried to be brave, but I have a baby now. I can't risk her. Please don't forget me. And if you ever meet my daughter, tell her I fought as long as I could. The judge read it twice. Then a third time. His hands didn't shake this time, but his chest ached like he'd been punched. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was something darker, something deliberate. He called an emergency meeting, not in a courtroom, but in a quiet conference room at the district attorney's office. Only 3 people attended: the judge, Ruiz, and a senior prosecutor known for taking on tough, messy cases others avoided. They laid everything out: the photo, the note, the unfiled statement, the neighbor's account, the pattern of silenced witnesses. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. Not of a lone abuser, but of someone who'd learned how to work the system, how to use silence as a weapon, and how to make problems disappear permanently. The prosecutor leaned back, rubbing his temples. Even with this, it's thin, no body, no direct evidence of foul play. He's been clean since, married, owns a small business, volunteers at his kid's school. The community sees him as a good guy. But we know better, Ruiz said quietly. The judge looked at them both. We don't need to prove what happened to Elena, not yet. But we can prove he obstructed justice, that he intimidated a witness, that someone in the system helped cover it up. The prosecutor hesitated. Going after a cover-up means pointing fingers inside our own house. That doesn't go over well. I don't care, the judge said, voice steady. This isn't about politics. It's about a little girl who walked into a courtroom and reminded us that some truths don't expire. They agreed to move carefully, but move they would. Meanwhile, the girl's life continued in quiet rhythm. She went to school, did her homework, played with the neighbor's dog, but every evening she asked the same question. Any news? Her foster mother never lied. They're still looking, she'd say, and they're not giving up. One afternoon, while sorting through another box of her grandmother's belongings, the girl found something new. A small key taped to the back of an old photo album. It wasn't labeled, just a tiny silver key on a frayed red string. She showed it to her foster mother, who recognized it right away. That's a safe deposit box key, she said, from the First County Bank. Your grandma must have kept something important. They called the bank the next morning. Because the girl was a minor, they needed a court order to access the box, but given the circumstances, the new judge assigned to her case approved it within hours. Inside the box, wrapped in a soft cloth, was a journal. Dozens of pages filled with Elena's handwriting, dates, names, fears, hopes. And one name kept appearing. A man who worked in city records. Someone who'd once been seen having lunch with her former partner. Someone who had access to court files. Someone who could make documents vanish. It was the missing link. When the judge saw the journal, he didn't celebrate. He just nodded, jaw set. Now we have a path. Within days, warrants were issued. Not for murder, there wasn't enough for that, but for obstruction, tampering with evidence, and witness intimidation. The man from city records was taken in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. But when shown the journal entry describing a late-night meeting in a parking garage, details only someone involved would know, He cracked. He admitted to pulling. Elena's witness statement before it could be filed said he'd been paid to keep things quiet, said he didn't know what happened to her after that, but he knew who gave the order. And that name led straight back to the man who'd once stood in court claiming to be a changed person, a devoted father, a pillar of the community. The arrest made headlines, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. A quiet unraveling of lies that had held for over a decade. Neighbors were stunned. Friends couldn't believe it. But the girl? She just listened to the news report on the radio, then turned it off and went outside to swing on the porch swing, the journal tucked safely in her backpack. She didn't need the headlines. She already knew the truth. Back at the courthouse, the judge stood at his office window, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk fell. He thought about Elena, about the life she might have had, the daughter she'd tried so hard to protect. And he made a silent promise, not just to find answers, but to make sure her daughter never had to fight alone again. Because sometimes, justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers, through a child's voice, a forgotten journal, a key hidden in an old box. And if you're willing to listen, it can change everything. The trial didn't happen in a packed courtroom with cameras flashing and dramatic outbursts. It happened quietly over weeks in a smaller chamber where the air smelled of old wood and strong coffee. The man who'd once stood beside Elena in happier photos now sat at the defense table, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding everyone. He didn't deny the obstruction, didn't argue about the payments or the missing documents. When the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the journal, the unfiled statement, the testimony from the city records clerk, he just nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for years. He wasn't charged with causing Elena's disappearance. There was still no body, no direct proof of what happened the night she vanished. But the court found him guilty of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to interfere with a legal proceeding. The sentence wasn't life in prison, but it was enough. Enough to strip away the quiet life he'd built on lies. Enough to send a message that silence bought with fear doesn't last forever. For the girl, it wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. She didn't attend the trial. Her foster mother thought it best she stay away from the heavy weight of it all. Instead, she spent those days at the park, at school, drawing in her notebook, pictures of her mother smiling, of courthouse steps bathed in sunlight, of a man in a robe standing beside her like a quiet guardian. But the real turning point came not from the verdict, but from a phone call 2 weeks later. A distant relative, Elena's younger sister, who'd moved out of state years ago and lost touch during the chaos, had seen the news. She called child services, then the foster mother, then, with permission, the girl herself. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I looked for you both," she said. "After Elena disappeared, I tried everything. But I was young, broke, and no one would tell me anything. I thought you were gone too." They met on a Saturday afternoon at a quiet cafe with big windows and mismatched chairs. The aunt brought photos, real ones, not newspaper clippings. Pictures of Elena as a child, laughing on a swing, holding a newborn baby, dancing barefoot in the rain. The girl stared at them like they were treasures pulled from the sea. "I look like her," she whispered. "You are her," the aunt said, tears in her eyes. "And I'd be honored if you'd let me be part of your life." It wasn't an instant fix. Trust doesn't grow overnight, especially when it's been buried under years of silence. But they started slow, weekend visits, phone calls, shared meals. And with every meeting, the girl's shoulders relaxed a little more. She began to laugh more, to ask questions, to imagine a future that included family who remembered her mother not as a victim, but as a person, kind, stubborn, full of dreams. The judge watched from a distance. He didn't insert himself, didn't try to be a hero, but he made sure the system didn't get in the way. He quietly cleared paperwork, smoothed transitions, and ensured the girl's voice was heard in every decision about her future. And when the court finally approved the aunt as her permanent guardian, he signed the order with a steady hand and a quiet sense of peace. One warm afternoon, months later, he drove to the edge of town, where a small house with a white fence and a blooming garden now held the girl and her aunt. He wasn't in his robe, just a button-down shirt, slacks, and the same worn shoes he'd worn the day she first spoke to him in court. She was waiting on the porch swing, barefoot, sketchbook in her lap. He walked up the path slowly. She looked up and smiled. Not a big, showy smile, but the kind that reaches your eyes. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he replied. They sat together on the steps, the late sun painting everything gold. He didn't ask about school or plans or the future. He just sat beside her, quiet, like two people who'd shared something too big for words. After a while, she closed her sketchbook and turned to him. "Do you think she's proud of me?" He didn't hesitate. "I know she is. Because I spoke up? Because you never stopped believing she mattered." She nodded, then reached into her pocket and handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a new drawing, of the two of them, standing on courthouse steps, sunlight between them. At the bottom, in careful letters, she'd written, "Thank you for listening." He held it gently like it was made of glass. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You reminded me why I do this." She tilted her head. "Will you keep looking for her?" He looked out at the trees swaying in the breeze. "As long as there's a chance, yes. But even if we never find her, we found the truth, and that's something she fought for." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder just for a second before hopping up. "Want to see my garden? I planted sunflowers," he smiled. "I'd like that." And as they walked toward the backyard, past rows of bright yellow blooms reaching for the sky, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, slow, tender, built on honesty and the courage of a little girl who said 4 words no one expected. Back in the city, the courthouse still stood, gray and solid. Cases came and went. Judges ruled. Lawyers argued. But in one quiet corner of the building, a file once marked closed now bore a new label. Active review pending. Because some stories don't end with a gavel. They end with a child finally feeling safe, with a family reconnected, with a man in a robe remembering that justice isn't just about laws, it's about people. And sometimes all it takes is 4 words to change everything.